After nearly a century of constant missteps, incompetent or tyrannical emperors, plagues and rural depopulation, military and agricultural decline, and a loss of martial vigor and the traditional values that had once made it the most glorious civilization in history, quite simply, the Roman Empire was now on the verge of total collapse. And that would have been definitely the case. The glorious empire of Augustus would have completely disappeared from the face of the earth 2 centuries earlier than expected during that terrible crisis of the 3rd century, if it were not for one and only one man. And that man, of course, was our favorite goat, Emperor Aurelian, the restorer of the world. In just 5 years of his reign, he was able to restore order to the most basic and complex structures of the empire. He significantly reduced corruption at the very core of that system, reconquered the empire's fragmented and rebellious territories, reminded the entire world why a woman ruling anything would be cringe, and laid the groundwork for the official establishment of a new unifying religion for the empire, Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. Simply put, if we call him the restorer of the world, it is not for nothing. He clearly deserved that title. And although sadly, his reign was cut short after just 5 glorious years due to his assassination, the short time he was in power was so effective in reversing all the empire's most pressing problems that, by his mere existence in history, he was able to prolong the life of the empire for 2 centuries more than it would have been without him, especially in the West. With a leader as competent as the empire had not seen since the times of the 5 good emperors, we are in the right to ask ourselves, what if Aurelian survived? That's the alternate scenario we're going to explore today. So, to start with this alternate timeline, let's prevent his assassination. In our timeline, Aurelian was murdered by one of his officers after his secretary, named Eros, falsely accused him of treason. As was very common at the time, a slight change in the timing of when that accusation would occur, a slight change in context, place, or whatever, would be more than enough for Aurelian to find out about the stabbing in the back that his secretary would do to him, preventing his murder and executing the creeping and cowardly Eros. So, once Aurelian survives his assassination, the first thing he would do is exactly what would be in his character, something pragmatic, logical, but also controversial. Just like Dacia, perhaps even more so, Britain was a useless province for the Romans, very expensive to maintain, and not at all profitable, at least under the logistics and reasoning with which they operated until that point, and you will understand later what I mean by that. Britain in the 270s CE is a prestige garrison with bad weather. It was a place where you paid to move coin, grain, and replacements across the channel. You babysit an island that contributed little to nothing to the existential frontier fight, and every cohort you parked in places like Eboracum or Isca was a cohort you didn't have on the Rhine when the Germanic barbarians were testing your nerves. Meanwhile, the real menace, the menace that will decide in less than 2 centuries if Rome lives or dies, isn't in places like Londinium, but rather in the vast forest between the Rhine and the Oder rivers. So, if Aurelian had lived, I don't think it's that crazy to consider that he would do with Britain what he already did with Dacia, abandoning it. But with the province being, for the time being, less exposed and in constant attack like it would be a century later, the island stays Roman in name. Taxes still flow via merchants and estates, but the heavy garrison would go back in mainland Europe. He would probably call it a temporary redeployment, and after that declaration would move 30,000 men to where they'll actually matter for Rome's near-future survival. He would stagger the evacuation over 2 campaigning seasons so the ports don't choke. He would strip Britain's legions down to skeleton detachments, fold their best men into mobile field armies on the Rhine and Upper Danube, and leave behind exactly what you need to prevent panic, a clean, competent, and loyal governor, a few tough cohorts in the main towns, and a beacon-to-beacon coastal warning chain. The Classis Britannica isn't scrapped, it's rebased to Gessoriacum on the Gallic side, where it can patrol the channel and smash pirates without wasting troops inland. Britain gets militias and tax breaks, and Gaul gets ships and soldiers. Essentially, the province would be transformed into a semi-independent client state of the imperial central authority in a progressive and subtle manner. All of those actions would be about building and gathering a gigantic army, the biggest one in Roman history until that point. Aurelian would want a hammer big enough to break Germania in half and keep hitting it until it stops moving, for good, Mongol Empire style, if you know what I mean. But to do that, he needs a continental reserve, not border police sprinkled thin, but a concentrated force that can march fast, hit hard, and pivot between the Rhine and the Danube without collapsing the provinces it passes through. After having initiated all the administrative, logistical, and military measures, Aurelian would wait a few years to see his actions bear fruit, and for the greatest Roman army in history to be ready for the glorious day when they would finally end the Germanic threat forever. But to ensure not only military but also moral victory for the Romans in the face of such a brutal campaign as the one that was approaching, he had to reform the state from its core, and also Roman society as a whole, and in our timeline he had already left clues as to the direction in which he wanted to take all these reforms. Aurelian understood that the empire needed a new status quo of dogmas to believe in, a new global ideology. It needed society reformed from its deepest core, from the temples down to the campfires, and that's exactly what he would have done. In our timeline, we already have hints of it. Aurelian had already started elevating Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, as a kind of universal Roman god, but if he had lived longer, he would have gone much further. This wouldn't just be a cult with some festivals and a temple in Rome. This would need to become the ideological spine of the empire. And here's the genius twist. He wouldn't do it alone. He would pair Sol Invictus with Venus. Why Venus? Because Aurelian understood something very dangerous about Christianity. It was winning over women. As is often the case with ideologies based on using victimhood and martyrdom as the primary tool and weapon for gaining influence and soft power, these ideologies tend to spread naturally first through the weaker sex, women left behind by the weaker men who created the good times prior. Women were the first base of the Christian movement, drawn to its promises of dignity, compassion, and spiritual equality, and if Rome wanted to beat Christianity, it couldn't just persecute it, it had to outcompete it, it had to offer something better. So, Aurelian would do something bold, something very Roman, in the sense of how pragmatic it would be, but also very forward-looking. He rewrites the myths, Venus, the eternal mother of Rome, the goddess of love and fertility, divorces Mercury and marries the unconquered sun, and now you don't just have a masculine war god, you have a divine couple, love and light, fertility and eternity, ruling side by side. And under their banner, Roman women are not ignored anymore, but mobilized. Let's be clear here, this doesn't mean modern equality, gosh, not at all, but it does mean something revolutionary by Roman standards. Women gain new recognition, new rights, and new roles. Education for girls expands, supervised by the Vestal Virgins, who stop being just a tiny priestly clique and start becoming a kind of female intellectual order of the state. Daughters can be sent or sold to Vestal academies where they learn literacy, bookkeeping, even rhetoric, not to replace men, but to support them to work together. Suddenly, being a Roman woman is no longer about being hidden in the shadow of the household, at least not entirely, but about being an honored servant of Venus and Sol Invictus with a defined mission inside the empire. And Aurelian would also reform the army, not just in structure, but in family life. He would legalize marriages for soldiers, which had been technically forbidden before. Why? Because an army with families is an army that doesn't desert, doesn't rebel as easily, and fights twice as hard. Imagine Roman camps now not as barracks of lonely men, but as little mobile communities. The wives are there to cook, prepare supplies, manage the baggage trains, nurse the wounded, and keep morale alive. Husbands now fight not just for pay in Rome, but for their wives and children sitting right behind the fortifications. For Aurelian, this is not softness, this is efficiency. He would be cutting wasted labor, boosting morale, and making every legion a self-contained Roman town on the move with the motivation of a lion to keep alive and protect their beloved wives and children, vulnerable to the enemies in the front, especially when we're talking about the Germanic barbarians. And this, of course, has ripple effects. Women become visible in public life in new ways. They help in logistics, in temple education, in the administration of supply chains. Philosophers and intellectuals, backed by the state, begin writing and debating against Christian ideas in public schools, a system of public schools similar to the one in the Aztec public school system from our timeline, which would systematically dismantle their appeal with logic and tradition. It would be literally like, why follow the Christians when Venus herself, the mother of Rome, now calls you to serve the light of Sol Invictus type of logic they would indoctrinate in new generations of women? This is the true genius of Aurelian's reforms. Christianity promised women dignity through martyrdom and rejection of the established previous world, just like modern ideologies are doing to our modern women, but Aurelian instead gives them dignity through participation, not as equals, but as respected pillars of Roman strength, mothers of soldiers, administrators of education, guardians of tradition, and yes, as priestesses of Venus in her new unconquered solar marriage. Of course, all these changes would take a long time to be clearly implemented everywhere, but knowing how efficient Aurelian was in everything he achieved in 5 years in our timeline, I have no doubt that in another 5 hypothetical years, he could achieve great things too, no matter how ambitious they may seem to us. And just a few years after surviving his assassination, Roman society would already look different. Men are drilled harder, women are more visible and more valued, children are being raised in schools infused with pagan nationalistic propaganda, while Christianity would start to look less like the religion of hope and more like the religion of outsiders, of cringe weirdos. The empire itself becomes the religion, the community, and the family, all united under Sol Invictus, shining from the sky, eternal, unconquered, and now married to the very goddess who gave birth to Rome. So, once all the reforms are in motion, once the new ideology is spreading through the temples and newly formed and created public schools, the campaign that would decide once and for all if Rome would forever live in fear of the forests of northern Europe or not, would finally start. Because you have to understand, the Germanic threat was not a nuisance, it was the main real threat. For centuries, the Rhine and the Danube rivers had been Rome's most dangerous frontiers, and since the times of Marcus Aurelius, every decade, some Alemanni, some Marcomanni, some Goths, some Vandals would come crashing through, burning towns, killing civilians, draining the treasury, forcing emperors to waste whole reigns just putting out fires, having to endure massive inflation and economic crises, which was even more aggravated during the height of the 3rd century crisis. Aurelian knew that if this continued, sooner or later Rome would collapse from exhaustion, and he wasn't going to patch the wound like his predecessors, he was going to cut it out like the based goat that he was. So the plan would be simple, but absolutely brutal. No negotiations, no compromises, no more federated allies nonsense. Germania is not a partner, it's a tumor, a plague filled with germs. Literally the name of these people already tells you that. And plagues are not bargained with, they are removed entirely. The buildup would start around 280 CE. Aurelian would wait, train, reform, and supply depots in Gaul and Pannonia. He would build fortified bridges and roads to move faster across the frontier. He would have 30, 40, even maybe 50,000 extra men compared to what the empire could normally field in this region, organized not as thin border police, but as massive concentrated strike armies. And when everything would be finally ready, the baseness of the revitalized Roman army would finally begin. Villages are not spared, they're burned, and tribes that resist are exterminated to the last. What about the few survivors left? They're either deported deep into Roman territory, scattered so they can never reform, or enslaved and used to fuel the economy. Rivers that once carried raiders into Roman land now carry Roman warships upstream, cutting through the heart of Germania. Every victory isn't just a battle won, it's a psychological message: resist and be erased, surrender and maybe live, but never again as an independent people. Once again, in a very Mongol Empire vibe of conquest, just picture how it would look like. And here's the thing, this would not be as impossible as it sounds at first glance. We're not talking about tens of millions of people here. In reality, Germania between the Rhine, Oder, and Danube rivers probably had 5 to 6 million people at most. For an empire of 50 million, with concentrated logistics and years of preparation, plus in addition to the new female labor contribution, especially in the Roman armies, this was a war that could be fought and won with overwhelming force and ruthless intent, especially because there would not be an attempt to negotiate or find diplomatic agreements with absolutely anyone here, just pure total annihilation or absolute submission, nothing more, without any possible compromise. Don't make me mistaken, this would be a total and absolute genocide, the largest genocide in history up to that point, and proportionally to the population density, the largest that even up to today in our timeline would not have been achieved. And the rewards? Unimaginable. Morality aside, unbeknownst to the Romans, this would have created a gigantic domino effect, which would have prevented almost 2 millennia of constant problems and conflicts started by Germanic peoples, or their descendants who had settled for generations in historically Roman lands, in addition to preventing the existence of an extremely well-known Austrian painter, which would be the ultimate irony. Once the forests are cleared, Germania becomes Rome's new engine of growth. Hundreds of billions of trees for timber, shipbuilding, and fortifications. In modern Germany alone, there are more than 90 billion trees, now imagine in ancient times, in a territory as gigantic as the one mentioned. Wide, fertile plains opened up for agriculture once the forest would be cut back. Rivers like the Elbe and Oder turned into Roman highways, connecting new colonies to the heart of the empire. Germania is no longer the nightmare across the Rhine, it's the new frontier of Roman civilization, just like Augustus dreamed about long ago. Of course, it's not just about resources, it's about psychology. Rome becomes feared again, not just respected. The same way the Mongols terrified Eurasia 1,000 years later, Aurelian's Rome would terrify Europe. The message would spread, oppose Rome, and you don't just lose, you disappear. The Alemanni, the Vandals, the Marcomanni, the Gepids, the Cherusci, the Franks, Lombards, Saxons, Rugii, Burgundians, and way more, all of them would be wiped out, scattered, or absorbed until nothing remains but ruins around the now new Roman colonies. If Julius Caesar, with a much smaller army, was able to kill 1 million Gauls and enslave another million in less than 8 years, I think that with a population as dispersed as that of the Germans over such a vast territory, achieving the feat described in this alternate timeline would not be as crazy as it sounds. By 285, or at most 290 CE, Germania is pacified, annexed, and resettled, and its people would be completely erased from history. Roman veterans and loyal provincials are given land, new towns rise where forests once stood, and Germania is slowly transformed into just another Roman province. Dacia, once abandoned, now can be reconquered and resettled as well, this time under secure Roman control, just because the tribes that made it a nightmare are simply no longer there. And here is where we would see the genius of Aurelian's long-term vision. Every emperor before him treated Germania as a frontier to defend, a wall to guard, but Aurelian, with the cold, and yes, I'll admit it, sometimes cruel pragmatism that defined him, treated the German problem as a cancer to be cut out once and for all, and by doing so, he doesn't just buy Rome a few decades of peace. He potentially erases the very people who, in our timeline, would go on to sack Rome, carve up the West, bring down the empire, and define everything about Western civilization until today. The Roman Empire would no longer be playing defense, it is feared, it is respected, and it is once again, in the truest sense, unconquered, with the children of Sol Invictus shining, not just on their territories around the Mediterranean, but now across the Elbe and Oder rivers and beyond, in lands that, in our timeline, would one day be called Germany, Czechia, Slovakia, and more, except here, they are simply Rome, once and for all. So, after the Germanic problem is solved once and for all, Rome enters into something completely new. This is not the Rome of Augustus. This is not even Trajan's Rome. This is a Rome with a new identity, a proto-nationalism, if you will. For the first time, Romans don't just see themselves as an empire of provinces glued together by conquest, but as one united people, bound by ideology, religion, and shared destiny to defeat the enemy, which was anything the emperor would need to be, just like with the Germans. And this identity would have been built on 3 pillars: Sol Invictus, Venus, and the memory of the Germanic genocide. Sol Invictus provides the eternal light, the emperor as his living champion. Venus provides the love, fertility, and feminine participation that keeps women invested in the system, and Germania provides the myth of terror, the reminder to every Roman that if barbarians threaten the state, Rome doesn't compromise, Rome doesn't negotiate, Rome just erases. That becomes the Roman version of manifest destiny. We are chosen by the sun to rule the earth, and anyone who gets in our way will simply cease to exist. Based. Administratively, this Rome is also different. Aurelian, paranoid but pragmatic, knows he cannot allow future instability like the crisis of the 3rd century to ever repeat itself, so he would restructures the system. Provincial governors are more tightly monitored, the army is divided into mobile reserves and frontier garrisons, and most importantly, he reforms the succession system, no more waiting for assassins, intrigues, or desperate last-minute adoptions. Aurelian, the restorer of the world, picks his heir while alive, a man trained, tested, and loyal, someone chosen for competence, not just bloodline or popularity, but out of pure merit. And because Aurelian reigns for decades, this system gets time to sink in. It becomes normal for emperors to designate successors clearly, backed by the army, the Senate, and the priesthood of Sol Invictus. Wait a second, decades? Yes, decades. And what about his lifespan, you might ask? Well, here we can play with reality. Aurelian was not a sickly, fat bureaucrat. He was a healthy, disciplined, active soldier in perfect physical condition. He was born in 214 CE, killed in 275 CE at the age of 61, but there's no reason he couldn't have lived longer. Look at history. Emperor Anastasius lived to 87. Justinian ruled into his 80s, even if he suffered from the Justinian plague and survived it, and even John VI of Cantacuzenos made it past 91 years old. Aurelian, with his lifestyle, his discipline, and now elevated by propaganda as the blessed servant of the unconquered sun, could realistically live into his 80s or even 90s. That means that instead of a 5-year reign, it would have been in this alternate timeline, 30 to 35 years of uninterrupted glorious reign, literally an entire generation under one unique strong hand. The social consequences of his reforms would now be fully visible. The women of Rome, integrated into education, camps, and the economy, gave the empire something far more precious than any victory, a higher birth rate. For centuries, Rome had suffered from elite infertility, from men refusing marriage, and from declining population. Now, with women believing they had a purpose, a role in the imperial destiny, and pride as daughters of Venus and Sol Invictus, they once again wanted to have children, a lot of children, because now the future looked hopeful again, not chaotic. The empire becomes young once again, vibrant, full of new blood, just as Christianity withers into a forgotten little sect, a fringe movement with no chance of competing with a state that gives women dignity through participation, not martyrdom, and within a century, Christianity could realistically vanish into silence, just another minor cult erased from the stage of history. And what does all this mean for the world? Well, inside Rome, a new golden age would begin. Education spreads, the economy recovers, public works and schools are established and normalized, and the empire feels alive again. But outside Rome? Oh no, just pure, sheer terror. Due to the world having now seen what Rome is capable of when it stops playing nice, the Germanic genocide would become a legend. Whole peoples, tribes, and small nations or kingdoms wiped out, forests burned, rivers turned into Roman highways. With all of that, everyone else, the Sassanids, the Slavs, the Huns, or more to come in the future, would think twice before provoking the empire that can simply decide to erase a people from the map without any restraint or diplomacy allowed. The Mongols would do it in the 13th century, but Aurelian's Rome would do it in the 3rd, and the psychological impact of that would be priceless. No longer is Rome the tired giant begging for peace. Rome is now the empire of terror and destiny, feared as much as admired, respected as much as loved. The children of Sol Invictus, with their wives and children beside them in camps, with their new proto-national identity, march across the world as the hammer of pure and absolute civilization, whether you like it or not. And that, Aurelian, the restorer of the world, the goat of goats in this alternate timeline, would have ensured that this will remain the case long, very long after his death. And with that, I think this is a good moment to end this video. I hope you enjoyed this alternate scenario about the restorer of the world surviving. By the way, guys, next week, to celebrate having reached 30,000 subscribers, I'll be making a new video answering your questions. I've already created a post in the channel's community so you can comment on your questions, but you can also ask them in the comments of this video. All questions are welcome, although I'd appreciate more original ones than asking me about an alternate scenario you'd like me to do. I'm really looking forward to your questions so I can answer them next week. Anyway, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, become a member of the channel in order to have early access to new videos, and comment on what you thought of it. Thank you to the first members of my channel. Shout out to you guys, and I deeply appreciate your support of my work and projects to come. And without anything else to say, see you next time.